It's time for another 1/24th scale RC build, combining the great looks of this Nissan 300ZX with a custom designed and 3D printed chassis. This project features a slightly revised update of the platform I used previously for this C6 Corvette, resulting in various improvements, though no build video is complete without a little drama. From the initial unboxing to the first test drive, here's what it took to build this super scale micro RC racer. Hello everyone and welcome! I want to start today's video by giving a huge thanks to everyone who checked out my previous project, that being this 2005 C6 Corvette. That was a very fun build, which I documented in detail here on the channel. Underneath that nice looking body was an all-new 1/24 scale 3D printable chassis design, specifically created for these types of plastic model to RC conversions. While the initial iteration of this design certainly proved to have some potential, it was clear that there's some room for improvement. That of course can only mean one thing: time to build another car. Now if you're interested in learning more about this chassis and hearing some of the thoughts I had as I progressed through the design process, I would certainly recommend you check out that aforementioned Corvette build video, as this project sort of picks up where that one left off. But basically the idea behind this chassis is to provide a balance of functionality and performance, while being built around inexpensive off-the-shelf components with plastic parts that can be 3D printed on a typical hobby-grade machine. This isn't the most basic RC chassis I've ever designed, but also far from the most intricate and difficult to assemble. A nice middle ground of not having anything that's too difficult to 3D print or build, but you'll certainly want to have some experience working with smaller components like these before putting one of these chassis together. While incorporating details such as a full-depth interior and engine bay might not be all that doable with this particular design, it does maintain a relatively low profile, enabling at least a more shallow interior and engine bay to be installed, again striking that balance of scale aesthetics and RC performance. For me, I think I pretty much nailed that balance with today's project, and I'm super happy to be adding this 300ZX to the collection. Perfect time of year for these types of projects too, as the weather around here has not been particularly attractive for outdoor activities. Just getting these outdoor shots of the car was a bit of a pain, but these builds always look better under the sun than they do in the workshop. That Corvette may have been a great starting point, but I'm hoping to build upon that experience with today's project. So from start to finish, here's a look at this 1994 Nissan 300ZX. Ever since its introduction for the 1970 model year, the Nissan Z cars have earned their status as legendary sports cars, being admired by automotive enthusiasts throughout the world for decades. Now spanning 7 generations, the legacy of Nissan's line of fun and relatively affordable sports cars continues to this day. Nissan was growing throughout the 1960s and saw the importance of adding a sporty 2-seater vehicle to their lineup that would appeal to not just domestic buyers but also to international markets. They had previously produced a small roadster known domestically and in some foreign markets as the Fairlady. But with the new Z cars, Nissan had its sights set on more of a wide-appealing grand touring platform rather than the previous, smaller and more Spartan roadster, more in line with European offerings from Triumph, MG, Fiat, and Alfa Romeo. The result was an instant success, with the cars proving to be a hit in the North American market, with sales remaining strong for many years. In North America, these cars were initially sold under the Datsun name, as were all Nissan products during this time, though this would later change during the 1980s. While Japan and some foreign markets, such as Australia, would continue to use the Fairlady nameplate, continuing the legacy of the prior Roadster, it was insisted by the president of Nissan's USA division at that time that the Fairlady name would not appeal to male buyers. As a result, the cars here, probably wisely, were simply referred to by numerical designations, such as the 240Z, 280Z, and later the 300ZX, as is the case with the car I'll be building today. These numbers represented engine displacement, the 240Z having a 2.4-liter engine, the 280Z having a 2.8-liter engine, and so on. Later, the X, first being used on the second-generation Z cars with the introduction of the 280ZX, was meant to signify luxury and comfort features, with the car continuing to lean more and more towards grand touring, as well as a showcase of the latest technology rather than a pure sports car. Power outputs and luxury appointments would increase over the decades, culminating in the 4th-generation Z car, also referred to by its chassis designation Z32, which was introduced in 1989. Up to 300 horsepower and 283 foot-pounds of torque was on offer from its optional twin-turbocharged 3-liter V6, enabling acceleration to 60 between 5 and 6 seconds and a top speed of 155 miles per hour. Not bad for a car that was just as much about driver comfort and incorporating the latest tech as it was about all-out performance. Critical reception to the 4th Gen Z cars was overwhelmingly positive, with it being Motor Trend's Import Car of the Year in 1990. It combined impressive performance, agile handling, and maneuverability, in part thanks to its optional 4-wheel steering system, all of which was covered in a fantastic-looking body with styling that I think looks just as good today as it did when it first launched. Although initially thought to be a great value, for the US market in particular, prices for the 300ZX would quickly rise, in part due to inflation with the rise in value of the Japanese yen against the US dollar. By the mid-1990s, the base price was approaching $40,000, and you'd be paying at least $44,000 if you wanted the high-performance twin-turbo engine. While this could still seem like a bargain when compared to certain vehicles with comparable performance, such as a base Porsche 911, the base price had now exceeded that of a Corvette, was right in line with one of its main competitors, the Toyota Supra, and was well above the cost of a Mitsubishi 3000 GT, along with many other more modestly priced sporty cars on the market at that time. An impressive vehicle, but far from the bargain sports car it had established itself as decades prior. This, in large part, resulted in the Z-Car's retraction from the North American market after the 1996 model year. In other markets, the Z-Car would continue, and later come back to the North American market for the 2003 model year in the form of the 350Z. It showcased all new styling and a much lower base price, getting back to its roots, I guess you could say, as a more fun and affordable sports car, a legacy which continues to the current year. Obviously though, despite the lackluster sales numbers here in the States, due in part as a result of factors outside of Nissan's control, the 300ZX is still a very desirable car, representing one of Nissan's best high-performance offerings during the early 1990s. I think the 4th Gen Z cars really stand out, as it being a bit of a departure from the formula that had made it so popular in the beginning and would help later resurrect its success into the 21st century. Both the styling and very heavy focus on luxury and tech is somewhat unique to this generation. This particular flavor of Z-Car that I'll be building in today's video is a 1994 Version S 2-seater. I'm no expert here, but as far as I can tell, the Version S was exclusive to the Japanese market and was sort of a stripped-down, driver-focused variation, if I understand correctly. The Version S generally had the naturally aspirated engine and 5-speed manual transmission, along with other driver enhancements like Recaro seats, and some exterior trim and cosmetic enhancements too. Now, just like with some previous generations of the Z-Car, there were actually two different body and wheelbase options. There was the shorter 2-seater, which is what you see here, and then there was the 2+2, which offered a bit more space for rear seat passengers and cargo. It can be a little hard to tell one from the other, but an easy thing to look for is the location of the fuel filler door. It's in front of the rear wheels on the 2-seater and behind on the slightly longer 2+2. It's also worth pointing out that a convertible became available starting in 1993. Now, if you're a model builder interested in building a 300ZX, it sure looks like you've got some options, assuming the variety of kits that have been produced over the years aren't too hard to find. Now, this kit that I have here is from Fujimi. I have built some Fujimi kits in the past, but I think this might be the first time I've ever built one here on the channel. What I have here is the 2023 issue of this kit. However, as we can see here on ScaleMates, the tooling for this appears to go all the way back to the inception of the Z32 in 1989. There also seems to be a lot of kits for the prior Z31 body style, which is very tempting. I love the more boxy, wedged 1980s style look of the older 300ZXs as well. But yet again, that's the real beauty of building RC models in this scale. You're really not limited when it comes to choice. Just about any noteworthy, historic, desirable car throughout history has been produced in a 1/24th or 1/25th scale model. And then for the more obscure cars and trucks, there's maybe somebody out there who has 3D print files if you want to print one yourself. But as we go ahead and crack open this kit, this here is what's generally referred to as a curbside kit in the world of model car building. This simply means that the car lacks an openable hood and a detailed engine bay. The design of this kit is relatively simple and doesn't contain a ton of individual parts, although it is nice to see optional parts for a left-hand drive variant. While the parts count may be low, there is a ton of detail present on all of these pieces and looks to be a very accurate representation of the real car. I know some hobbyists out there like these types of kits, while others would prefer to see a ton of individual parts. The body is simply one molded piece. No worries about lining up those bumpers or hood, just a little sanding and paint prep and it's ready to go. Everything looks nicely molded, just a bit of flash and some mold lines in a few spots that will be very easy to remove with a sharp knife and some sandpaper. As I progressed through the assembly process, I noticed that this front piece didn't fit the best, and maybe the left side of the roof and C-pillar wasn't quite perfectly molded, possibly due to the age of the molds, but that's if you really want to nitpick. And with hindsight being 2020, I probably could have made some modifications on the front of the car to get this clear plastic piece to fit a bit better on the front. Right out of the box, the wheels look great. They come pre-painted, again showing some nice detail. I'll definitely be making these work with my custom RC chassis. The tires also look fantastic, very soft, nicely detailed with Bridgestone lettering. They even smell a bit like real tires. Very cool. The instructions are very well done. Japanese is obviously the primary language here, however a lot of things are labeled in English too. And then for some stuff like the colors, you can always use a translator app if needed. A little modern tech that comes in handy for stuff like this. Very simple, straightforward, and easy to follow, especially considering this is a relatively simple kit with a low part count. Not the most expansive decal sheet, but it's got everything you need as far as emblems, license plates, and dashboard, at least for one of these cars sold in the Japanese market. I was definitely excited to get this kit put together. It looks like it would be a nice simple build with not a ton of pieces to deal with, and I won't miss the lack of detail in the engine bay as I'm obviously using this for an RC conversion, so although nice to have, it's not really that critical, just gives me more room for the chassis and front suspension. The only real, slightly annoying thing with some of these Japanese kits is that sometimes they can be a bit more expensive than your more run-of-the-mill Revell, Monogram, and AMT kits, at least here in the States. Obviously, I'm sure the pricing varies depending on what country you're in. I was seeing a lot of these kits selling for around $35 US, although I've also seen some on sale recently at more like $25, possibly due to the holidays. For a relatively simple curbside kit, getting into the $30 and even $40 range might seem a little on the high side, but if you're a fan of this generation of Z-Car, I think you're really going to be happy with this kit. Also, I have seen the Tamiya 300ZX kit offered for even less, and seems to be very highly rated and capable of being built into a really nice finished car. I don't have one of these kits on hand, and I've never built one, so I don't really know how it might compare to the Fujimi, but it looks like it would be hard to go wrong no matter which you choose. Enough looking and talking about this kit though, I think it's time to start turning some screwdrivers and getting this car put together. Fresh off the 3D printer, it's time to start building a functional base for this 300ZX. This chassis that I have here is the same one I used previously for this 2005 C6 Corvette, which I featured in my previous full build video. This currently still unnamed chassis design, which is a bit of a work in progress, can be downloaded from our Patreon, which I'll have linked below in the description if you're interested in building one of these for your own project. That's in addition to various other smaller scale 3D printable RC chassis we have available, such as the CTC01 and FFR SC1. Whether you want to build a big rig, race car, or muscle car, we've got some solid options for the DIY RC model enthusiast. If you are interested in building one of these chassis along with me, I would again direct you to that prior C6 Corvette build video as I showcase the entire assembly process of this chassis step by step. For both the sake of brevity and my own sanity, I won't be going into that much detail in this video, though I do still have a few things I'd like to showcase and talk about today. As you may recall if you've seen that prior video, one of the shortcomings of that chassis was the amount of vibration in the rear end. While the rear suspension design is very simple and easy to 3D print, this large amount of vibration seems to be a negative side effect. Naturally, one of my goals for this build was to eliminate, or at least greatly reduce this amount of vibration, hopefully without the need for too many additional pieces. As discussed previously, I thought about simply adding some upper control arms, utilizing the same pieces used for the tie rods in the front. The problem though was I didn't get the angle correct, so it ended up severely restricting the movement of the rear suspension. I could fix this with a few design tweaks, however rather than throwing away the pieces that I had made, I decided to simply swap out the control arms with a couple of rubber bands. I have a bunch of these little rubber bands which I'm pretty sure are intended for braces, but they've come in handy for various projects and random things that I've built. What I have here now is sort of a push-pull, with the springs pushing the motor mount and axle assembly down while the rubber bands are pulling it back. This is in combination with this area here on the chassis being redesigned, along with also making a modification that allows two M2 screws to be threaded into the cup that holds the springs in place. By screwing these in and out, I can adjust how much pressure the springs are applying to the rear assembly, allowing for some adjustability. Not a very sophisticated setup, but this combination of changes has resulted in this chassis being a bit more refined overall, and has really cut down on any sort of vibration in the rear. Still very simple and low tech, but it's hard to argue with results. The suspension can still move and flex just as intended, but there's definitely less vibration like there was with that Corvette. And having the ability to adjust how much pressure the springs are applying is very nice. Keep in mind though that this suspension is still completely undampened with no shock absorbers present, so don't expect this thing to handle like a Mini Z. I've said it before, but tinkering and problem solving are necessary if you really want to dive deep into this genre of custom 3D printing and building RC models. If you want a more predictable, straightforward, and linear progression, stick with the well-established platforms and store-bought stuff. Not that these projects are the most difficult things to build, but you really need a bit of patience to achieve the best results in the end, and you can't always expect your first attempt to be a masterpiece. I gain experience with each one of these projects, and I feel like I learn something new or get a little better at something with each one. As long as you enjoy that slow but steady progression and don't let the minor setbacks get in your way, this really is a rewarding niche of the hobby. Enjoy the process even when things aren't going perfectly. I'll be demonstrating that a little later on in this video, but more on that to come. Obviously though, I do have some pretty tiny parts and hardware to deal with here, especially when putting together that FC01 front suspension and steering assembly. But before too long, I had everything that you see here put together and functioning just as it should. Not to sound too much like a broken record here, but ensuring your 3D printer is functioning optimally, producing high quality parts, along with being as precise as possible during the assembly process will result in a much better finished product. Apply the same level of focus and eye for detail when building this functional chassis as you would when building and detailing that model car body. From the very beginning, I knew I wanted to include the wheels and tires that come in this model kit, so I needed to figure out a way to secure them to this custom RC chassis. This can be much easier to do with some kits than others, as has been demonstrated with some prior builds. Fortunately though, this was an easy one, as the metal rod included in this model kit was around 2mm in diameter, which is the same as the axles used on this RC chassis. The kit includes these little adapters, or whatever you want to call them. They have pretty much the perfect inner diameter, so just a bit of glue will help hold everything together, and we'll just hope that they don't need to be removed anytime soon, as of course the main downside to gluing wheels in place is that it's not as convenient for maintenance or repairs. These here are replicating the BBS wheels that were available from the factory on the real cars, however I believe only for buyers in Japan. As you may have noticed earlier, a lot of the other kits do include the more common 5-spoke design that was sold here in the States as well as other markets. As nice as those 5-spoke wheels look, I do think that these BBS wheels really pair nicely with this car. Kind of a hard choice to decide which one I like more if I'm being honest, but make sure that you select the right kits depending on what wheel option you prefer. I'm not even going to bother painting them, they look great right out of the box. Now something included in the kit that I couldn't use here are the brake rotors. Fortunately, it'll be easy enough to simply modify a set that I had on hand to fit these wheels. I just needed to bore out the holes a little to fit, and later I'll get them painted. Earlier on in the build process, after I ensured that I would be able to use these wheels and tires, I did a quick mock-up with the M2 threaded shaft to figure out how long I needed to make the rear axle so it would fit the body. There's no one-size-fits-all solution in this niche of the hobby, so the exact length of the rear axle will vary from one project to another. It just depends on how wide the body is and what wheels I'm using. It's important that you take the time to get everything mocked up and cut the rear axle to the correct length, a classic case of measure twice, cut once. So far the chassis was coming together really nice, although I did make those tie rods a little too short, resulting in a lot of toe out on the front. A little bit of toe in or toe out can sometimes actually help the car to track straight, but this is a little excessive, so that is something I'll be fixing later on, but for now I just kept moving forward with the assembly. Of course, one of the main challenges of a plastic model to RC conversion like this is getting everything to fit onto the chassis, which is going to require some modifications, mainly to this interior piece. And by modifications, I mainly mean just cutting off the bottom. I'd like to position all of the electronics below the interior just like I did previously with that Corvette. In fact, I'll be using all the same electronics as I did with that prior project, including the 2S and 3S LiPo-compatible ESC. These aren't the smallest electronics that could be used for a conversion, but they strike a nice balance of performance while also remaining relatively small in size. When choosing the electronics, it's just a matter of what I want to prioritize, and in this case, I want to go for a blend of performance and scale aesthetics, not pivoting too hard to either side. Especially being a curbside kit with no engine or engine bay details, I figure that's a good way to go with this build. If you are interested in seeing a project that puts more of a focus on scale aesthetics, check out this 39 Chevy Coupe that I built. I'm also currently in the process of building a 69 Chevelle SS with a very heavy focus on scale realism. More updates coming on that build, just gotta find the time to edit. To make enough room under the interior did require quite a bit of hacking, as was expected. The new floor had to be cut pretty high, but as has been the case many times previously, once you get everything painted and put together, it's not always immediately apparent that these drastic changes have been made. I think with pretty much any build, a shallow interior will always be better than no interior at all. I like to start out by using tools like a hot knife or cutoff wheel to remove the majority of this piece, before being a bit more careful to cut and sand everything in a way that will create a nice level surface to glue the new floor in place, which is usually just a scrap piece of plastic. I'm really liking this multi-piece chassis design where I have a separate piece on top and below the main chassis piece. With a combination of M2 bolts and lock nuts, along with some spacers, which I'm using some 1.8mm inner diameter O-rings for, I can adjust how low I want the bottom of the chassis to sit from the ground and how high I want the body to be mounted, allowing enough room for the electronics in between. Basically, I want them to sit as low as possible without running the risk of the chassis being too visible when viewing the car from the side. Later, you'll see me use sets of rare earth magnets to hold the body on the chassis, which can be placed on this upper piece and the flat bottom of the modified interior. Just a really simple setup that even allows for some adjustability. After the magnets have been glued into place, if you notice one corner of the body sitting a little high, or maybe the body isn't quite perfectly parallel to the chassis, loosen up one or more of the bolts and nuts that's sandwiching everything together, pull on the upper piece as necessary, and retighten everything until it's lined up how you want it. Obviously, I do the best I can to ensure everything is lined up from the very beginning, but this eliminates the need to have to shim the magnets by adding little scrap pieces of plastic or whatever else to get the body sitting how you want. I've intentionally gone through and enlarged some of these holes, along with thickening up the main chassis piece, which both allows for some more adjustability and makes this version of the chassis stiffer than the prior one I used for the Corvette. I always do the best I can to get the body lined up correctly when gluing, but sometimes it can be hard to get it perfect, so it's nice just having the ability to nudge things a little into alignment if necessary. I know stuff like this, especially these tiny incremental changes, might not seem like much, but I think this is already proving to be a really nice setup. As you probably know, I love using these rare earth magnets to hold the body onto the chassis. They're plenty strong and very convenient for allowing access to change the battery or perform maintenance. A great way to go, although if you use something like Velcro, you don't have the stress of trying to get everything lined up perfectly, as it's not locked into one specific position. Every time you want to secure the body, you just make sure it's lined up, and if it isn't, you can just pull it back off and try again. I guess that makes Velcro the less stressful and easier option to install, but if you are willing to spend the extra time to get those magnets lined up perfectly, you just drop the body on top and it's perfectly aligned every time. Either way certainly works, but here's a look at this now much shallower interior. Of course, after cutting down the sides, I glued a thin piece of plastic in place to serve as the new floor. There really isn't much left of this interior at this point, but I wanted to ensure that there's plenty of room below for both 2S and 3S LiPo batteries, just in case I want to give this car a little more pep. As you'll see later on though, once everything gets painted, it sort of blends right in, and at certain angles you won't even really notice the severe lack of depth. Something that's been suggested a lot in the comments is adding some driver figures. I've done that for a few projects, but it's definitely something I'd like to get into more with some future builds. I think especially for these more shallow interiors, adding in some figures would help not only add a bit more life to these vehicles, but also help disguise the lack of depth. I do have a 3D model of a race driver with a helmet that I've made myself and have used for some prior builds. Modeling an actual human face is definitely not in my wheelhouse though, so maybe I'll do some searching and see what I can find as far as 3D print files go. In the meantime, however, with this 300ZX, I went ahead and cut down the seats so they'll fit this now much shallower interior. With that done, the interior modifications are complete, so I moved on to working on the rear of the body. Just like I did previously with that Corvette, what I wanted to do was cut off the rear section of this chassis piece included in the model kit, and then glue it to the rest of the body during the final assembly. This will not only provide a little bit of detail on the underside of the car, but also provide a nice place to secure the tailpipes. This is just sort of a rough mock-up, but this is going to work out great once everything has been painted and can be glued together. From there, it was time to collect all of the other parts of this kit that I'll be using for this custom RC conversion. This includes things like the side view mirrors, windshield wipers, and rear spoiler. This step can be quite tedious and time-consuming, but for the best final appearance, you'll want to take the time to cut and sand away any imperfections that may be present on any of these pieces. Sandpaper, hobby files, and a sharp knife are all very useful tools for this step. And then as you can see, I moved on to the body, doing the same thing, removing any flash or mold lines left over from manufacturing. It's stuff like this that I'm trying to remove. Basically any lines or manufacturing artifacts that wouldn't be present on the real vehicle. Again, it's tedious and it may seem insignificant, but it's the little things like this that can really help enhance the lifelike appearance of the finished model. I also went ahead and deepened some of the panel gaps, along with sanding the entire outer surface of the body with some 1000 grit sandpaper to help with primer and paint adhesion. Along with removing those imperfections, another important step is to test fit all of the parts to ensure they're a good fit before doing any painting. It's better to make any necessary modifications now, such as enlarging holes, rather than after everything has been painted, and then you run the risk of ruining your hard work figuring out that something doesn't fit. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier in this video, I probably should have done a little more work to this front piece as it's not a great fit, especially on the right side of the car. It is what it is, but sometimes even when you're careful, you can still miss little details like this, but in general, I like to make sure everything has been tested before paint and the final assembly. A little work here and there was necessary in a few spots, but really this kit goes together with minimal fuss, and it wasn't long before everything was ready for paint. Jumping back over to the chassis, I now want to go ahead and get all of the electronics installed. As mentioned, these are the exact same electronics I used previously for that Corvette. I'm not going for all-out scale realism here, which would require the tiniest electronics available, so why mess with success? I've got a simple 2S and 3S LiPo-compatible ESC, a relatively compact 2S LiPo battery, and a Radiolink R4 FGM receiver that I'll be linking to my RC6GS transmitter. Everything's just plug and play, except for the wires that go from the ESC to the motor. Just as before, I chose to cut those wires much shorter and solder them to the motor to save space and keep things tidier. It's a little snug to get everything to fit, but it all tucks away nicely under the body, not a ton of room to spare, but just enough to make it work. At this point, I had not yet glued the wheels into place, but with the chassis just about complete, this will be the final step, though not before painting and gluing the rotors. Like I said before, gluing these wheels is not exactly ideal from a maintenance standpoint, but remember when you're building RC models, there's always going to be some trade-off. Maybe with hindsight, a little black wash would look good to add a bit more depth, but I guess I could still do that now even with the car fully put together if I wanted to. These wheels and tires do look great though. I made a few more tweaks at this point to the upper and lower mounts on the chassis. I think I was trying to get the body to sit a little higher up. Again, these projects really require some patience, some finesse, a lot of mock-ups, test fits, and measuring. Just trying to take my time and make sure everything will be lined up and fit together correctly, making any modifications or adjustments as necessary. It's a gradual process, and I try not to slow the pacing of these videos down too much by showcasing every little minute detail. Best advice I can give to anyone doing a similar project is to just take your time and really focus on getting everything as well-fitting and correctly lined up as possible. Earlier I washed all of these parts after doing that sanding, so something I wanted to do now was glue this piece onto the front. In the previous video I posted here on the channel, I talked about some of the glues I like to use and some gluing tips for RC model car builders. Certainly a video I'd recommend checking out, but as I talked about in that video, you'll really want to ensure that these parts are as strongly secured in place as possible. If this car was only going to be for static display, just a little dab of glue in a couple spots would be fine for this piece, but considering the fact that this area of the car may very soon be encountering a few nasty bumps, I really didn't want to skimp on the glue in this area, as I want to try and eliminate the possibility that it could break away during a collision. If that happens, it could mess up the paint, and then I'm going to have to try and glue everything back together without messing it up further, just better if it never comes off in the first place. While the majority of your experience building an RC model will be the same as building a static model, this is something to keep in mind when putting your car together. Here's another important thing to keep in mind. Make sure that the front wheels have enough room to steer left and right. Whether or not any modifications are necessary will vary from chassis to chassis and body to body. Although it can slightly detract from the look of the finished vehicle, you may also want to consider having the front wheels sitting slightly further inside the body than where they would be on the real car. The steering on these RC chassis tends to have a larger sweep than what a real car would have, so in some situations a little massaging around the wheel arches will be necessary to prevent any wheel rub. Certainly it's not ideal to have to remove a ton of material, but I just did a little bit of massaging here just to make sure there's enough clearance. Not a big deal, and not a lot of material was removed, so with that done, this car is now finally ready for paint. It's time to really bring this car to life with some paint, though not before giving all of these parts a thorough wash, removing any dust or contaminants from the plastic to help with primer and paint adhesion. I then got them all secured using tape to make them easier to hold on to. Yes, you can buy actual body stands and pliers and rigs to hold all of your parts, but whatever works. After blasting the first round of paint and primer on all the parts that are getting sprayed in the booth, I moved back over to the bench and did some finer detail painting. I actually started out using a Sharpie marker to add some detail to the clear parts. It takes some time, but I went ahead and colored in the black outer sections of all the windows, as well as went around the outer edges, just to add that little bit of extra detail. If you're going for perfection here, the best way to do this would be to mask the clear sections of all the windows, and then airbrush the black borders. For a lot of popular model kits, you can actually buy masking decals that will be the perfect size and shape for all the clear sections. You just place them down in the right spots, airbrush the inside of the windows, and you're done. Freehanding it like this might not deliver the most crisp lines, but really once you get everything put together on the finished car, you wouldn't necessarily notice the difference unless you're really analyzing it closely. I do the best I can with the Sharpie, but sometimes even after a few passes, it can still be kind of translucent. So what I'll do next is add one final coat with some black paint, not worrying about getting it super close to the edges, but just making sure that the black outer edges of the windows are completely opaque. As long as you're careful, you can get some results like these. Again, not claiming this to be the cleanest or straightest lines ever, but perfectly presentable for what I'm building. Also note some of the matte black details that I added later on. Always make sure that you have some good reference material on hand so you can try and match the appearance of the car as closely to the real thing as possible. Painting the taillight panel took some patience, but wasn't all that difficult. Again, collecting a nice selection of reference material certainly helps. I started out with some transparent red and orange paint. With the parts and decals included in this kit, it is replicating a 300ZX that would be exclusive to the Japanese market. Not that it would be a lot of work to make it look like a car sold in another market, but I just decided to go completely box stock with this build. I wasn't 100% sure whether the turn signals would be orange or clear from the factory, as I've seen it both ways, but the instructions said to make them orange, so I'm just gonna hope that's correct. I then backed the lights with some silver, except for the third brake light up top. The kit actually includes a decal if you want to use it, but I noticed that the third brake light on a lot of these panels seems to blend in a little more with the black going across the top, so I thought I'd try and replicate that by not backing it with silver before backing the entire thing with black. Ended up making the third brake light kind of hard to identify, especially on camera. It is more noticeable when looking at it in person, but other than that, this rear panel really turned out looking great. I also went ahead and painted on that matte black line where the rear hatch would lift up on the real car, and of course I had to add the decals as well. The spots that you paint for the lights are really well defined on the backside of this panel, so you can just drip and brush that paint in there, and you'll still get really nice, crisp, clear borders just like this. A really nicely designed piece, as I have encountered some model kits that replicate cars with similar multicolor taillight panels, where there's some areas that should be black, some areas that should be red, maybe some that should be yellow or white, but they aren't really well defined, or these lines aren't really molded into that piece, so it just makes it a lot more of a pain to try and get everything to look correct. I think the last car that I built and showcased here on the channel that I kind of had that experience was this 85 Trans Am, where the taillight panel took a lot of work to get what I have here, and it still doesn't look quite as good as what I have here with this Nissan. A very subtle aspect of this kit, but kudos to Fujimi for doing it right, making our job as model builders easier. And of course, a little detail painting on these headlights helped make them look more like the real thing as well. Now going back over to some of the other parts, the painting process continued. Like usual with a lot of these projects, most of the spray cans I'm using are your typical hardware store Rust-Oleum and Krylon brand paints, but I did go back to the auto store and picked up some automotive touch-up paint for the body. I went with the Ford Deep Jewel Green Metallic, in an attempt to replicate Nissan's Black Emerald or Cobalt Green Pearl, which was optional on the real car. Sort of a dark green, but looks almost teal out in the light, which is not necessarily a color I would paint every car in, but on this mid-90s Nissan, I think it really fits, and I'm super happy with this color choice. We'll see more of that in a bit, but right now a number of parts had dried, and we're ready for some additional details to be added. I decided to hand paint the tailpipes with the tips being chrome and the mufflers being steel. After I was finished painting the mufflers, I dry brushed a small amount of that steel paint onto this rear piece, giving it some extra detail, even though it's on a spot of the car that won't really be noticeable. I'll set that aside to dry for now and moved on to the interior. Matte black is a good color choice for the interior as it's quite shallow and I don't want it to stand out too much. While this interior won't exactly be winning any awards, I went ahead and added a few small details, including adding in this nice instrument panel decal that's included in the kit. As someone who isn't exactly great at placing these water slide decals, I once again have to give some kudos to Fujimi as the decals included in this kit are very durable and easy to work with. But with that done, that's about it when it comes to adding details on the interior. I glued all of these pieces into place, with the assembly now ready to be secured to the rest of the body later on. After several coats of both paint and clear, followed by letting the paint dry for several days, it's now time to continue work on the body. While this is by no means a perfect, show-stopping paint job, I think it's certainly presentable. Using an airbrush and possibly paint specifically for model building would have the ability to achieve an even higher level of finish here, along with spending some time sanding and polishing. Within the context of this being a functional RC model, however, that's going to get driven around and more than likely get a few little nicks and scratches along the way. I'm pretty satisfied with how the body looks here. Not exactly a glass smooth finish, but a pretty nice result all things considered, without any major imperfections to speak of. While it's possible I could have worked a little magic with some polishing, I decided with this car I'd just keep moving along and began airbrushing some additional details, including the trim around the windows. I carefully masked off these areas, and then used an airbrush to apply the paint. I really don't like to skimp on the masking here, as I'd rather use a few extra cents worth of tape than have to deal with any overspray. It may have seemed like I finally got a project with no paint issues, but that simply wouldn't be the case. Taking off the masking removed paint on both the A-pillars and even into the roof on the one side. I just can't win with these builds. I thought I gave the body plenty of time to dry, but I suppose that could be the issue here. Regardless, it's masking and airbrushing that got me into this situation, so I'll use masking and airbrushing to get me out of it. I decanted some of that touch-up paint and put it into my airbrush, then carefully applied it to the affected areas, blending it in with the surroundings, following it up with some clear. Because this would have been a difficult area to sand the transition smooth, although maybe I should have done it anyways, I attempted to level out the affected area with the surrounding area with some floor polish. I thought if I could build this clear up thick enough, you wouldn't really be able to notice the affected areas, at least not without looking closely. After some time spent polishing and building up that clear, eventually I got it looking pretty good. Not quite perfect, but not a bad save. With this train now back on the tracks, I continued hand painting some additional details, including the lights on the front. I also watered down some black acrylic paint to create a black wash to accentuate the panel gaps. I think I really nailed that with this car. It's generally easier on darker colored bodies than lighter ones, but if anything the effect is a little too subtle with this car, which honestly I would prefer to have this be more of a subtle effect than something too noticeable. Stark black lines, I think at a certain point, can start to detract from the appearance of the car. Just trying to do it enough to add some more depth. But at this point, it was time to go ahead and start gluing these parts into place, starting with all the lights that go on the front. I made sure to use clear drying glue for all of these pieces to avoid any haze or excess being visible once it dries. I then moved on to securing the rear lights, as well as adding all of these water slide decals. I noticed the inside of the body doesn't look that great at the moment, so I painted this area in matte black. I just did it all with a brush. It's not like this area is going to be all that visible once the car is complete, just enough to make sure you don't see either the green body color or white bare plastic. What you see here looks a lot better than the alternative. Once that was done and the paint had dried, I could install the windows. I'm very happy to report that everything in this kit went together well, including the windows. I was able to place them exactly where they're supposed to go, once again using some clear drying glue, then I just let them sit until the glue hardened. Next thing to be installed was the interior. I used a generous amount of shoe glue to hold it in place and gave it plenty of time to dry. With the interior now installed, I'll turn my attention back to these parts that go in the rear. The painting I did earlier was dry, so I decided to use a couple of pastels to do a bit of subtle weathering. Like I said, it's not like the undercarriage of this car is going to be anything as detailed as some of my other projects, but it's an easy way to just add some dirt and grime on the underside of this vehicle, and then of course I glued the tailpipes into place, and after a final splash of matte black paint inside the tailpipes, this assembly is ready to be installed. Now it's time to add the side view mirrors. I guess if I were going for perfection, a dab of filler in a couple spots where the mirror would be on the real car would probably be ideal. Not the end of the world though, I simply applied the chrome paint, then set those aside to dry. In the meantime, I installed the front license plate and added the final water slide decals. I'm honestly not entirely sure what decal number 7 and number 8 are on this sheet. I think number 8, which goes on the center of the windshield, is like a registration sticker, but I just went ahead and put them both where instructed in the manual. The rear wiper and spoiler were next. There are no holes or slots for that spoiler, so it's important to make sure it's aligned correctly, not too far forward or too far back. Once again, reference images are your friend here. Finally, I could add the side view mirrors, and that pretty much concludes the assembly of this Nissan 300ZX body. I did still need to glue in some body mounts. Before I started on that, I finally swapped out the tie rods so the toe angle would be better on the chassis. Just like I talked about earlier, I glued a set of magnets onto this upper piece of the chassis. I then placed a little piece of paper between the two magnets so they don't accidentally get glued together, before topping each magnet with some thick shoe glue, and then placed the body on top, getting everything aligned as accurately as possible. I let the car sit overnight, and here's the result the next day. The body is well aligned and can easily be removed when needed. One final small detail I added was I used a black Sharpie to color in the center caps on each of the wheels. These would have the BBS logo on the real car, but I thought this final touch might help add just that little extra bit of detail. But with this Make It RC decal applied, this 1/24 scale model is now complete. Time to admire the finished vehicle and take it for a test drive. Probably needless to say, but I'm very happy with how this car turned out. I really took my time with this one and just sort of pieced it together here and there over the course of a few weeks. And a few minor issues aside, I think it really shows. The details, the paint color, the wheels, it just came together to produce a nice looking model that ended up being relatively simple and straightforward to build. Of course, a lot of credit goes to the Fujimi model kit. A few nitpicks aside, it's a fantastic kit that I would certainly recommend, especially if you can get one for between 20 and 30 bucks. Now, is this the best Z32 Nissan plastic model kit out there? I'm really not sure, as there are quite a number of kits to choose from, including ones from manufacturers Tamiya and Hasegawa. Do keep in mind that this particular model kit does not include an engine or openable hood, so that could be a deciding factor with what kit you decide to go with. But like I said earlier, I think this paint color in particular was a great choice and pairs perfectly with this 94 300ZX. Sort of seems like a very 90s color to me, and that metallic finish really gives it some depth and makes it look like a much lighter teal out in the sun. Just a really nice look for this car. Just as I've mentioned with numerous projects prior, I like to balance out some of the more intricate and complex projects, like that 69 Chevelle I'm building, with some more basic builds like this Nissan. With that 69 Chevelle, I'm modifying the frame piece included with the model kit to have a functional suspension, using some tiny 3D printed components that I'm trying to make both look and function as close to the real thing as possible. In contrast with a project like this, I just build a universal RC chassis that's the correct width and wheelbase, and then plop the body down on top, making sure it looks good from the outside. Both projects are fun in their own way, but if you're interested in getting into this niche of the RC hobby, a project like this is going to be a lot easier and more straightforward than something like that Chevelle. I have posted all the STL files that I used for this particular chassis over on our Patreon, including the updates I've made with today's project. Huge thanks as always to all of our members over on Patreon, as well as all of the channel members here on YouTube, as it's your support that helps make these videos possible. As I talked about earlier, a little more work is needed to incorporate some better functioning upper control arms, but if you like to use what I have here, you're welcome to print your own copy. Thankfully, the combination of rubber bands and coil springs is working pretty well for this Nissan. I've reduced the amount of vibration, and I like having that additional adjustability. Still going to be tinkering with this chassis design some more though. The car does drive really smooth, and that 4,000 RPM N20 motor provides some pep, certainly suitable for a highly detailed RC model like this. Like I said before, if you want maximum speed and handling, this really isn't going to be your best option, but I've had a lot of fun cruising around with this car while also trying to be careful not to wreck this great looking body. I did take it a little easier than I had to going around this slightly elevated foam track. I really didn't want to run the risk of going off of it with no guardrails present, and then crash into the wall or damage the car in some other way. All around though, just a really nice, simple, straightforward build that's not only a fun car to drive, but also looks great on the shelf. Not necessarily a project that's going to set the pavement or the internet on fire, but sometimes these simple builds are just as much fun. I certainly enjoyed putting together today's video, and I hope you all enjoyed watching. Clicking that like button is always appreciated, and feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this one in the future. But I've got a lot of editing to do, so I'm going to get back to that. In the meantime though, and as always, thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.